What would you do if in the dead of winter, a stranger appeared barefoot at your door, half frozen, desperate, and whispering only one word? Please, would you let her in risk the peace you built in solitude, or turn her away to face the storm alone? The wind has a way of talking up here on the ridge, and that night it was telling a bitter story. It was the kind of cold that didn't just seep into your bones. It laid claim to them. I could hear it howling between the pines, a lonely sound that matched the one in my own soul. For 5 years that sound had been my only steady companion, and I'd come to prefer it over the chatter of men. Inside my cabin, the world was reduced to the orange glow of the wood stove. Its heat breathed life into the small space I'd built with my own 2 hands, log by log, scar by scar. The mud chinking between the logs was cracked like an old man's face, each line a memory of a winter past. I sat at the rough-hewn pine table, the frost melting from my boots and puddling on the floorboards as I drew a whetstone along the edge of my skinning knife. The rhythmic scrape was a kind of prayer in the silence. Silence was what I'd come for. After the war, after the noise and the shouting and the smell of blood, I'd had my fill of the world of men. I bought this piece of land so high up most folks considered it worthless, and I planted myself here like a stubborn tree. My life was a simple loop-cut wood-haul water mend. The fences the snow broke. I ate what I shot, drank coffee thick enough to chew, and spoke only to my horse, and only when he needed calming. It was a quiet existence, and I trusted it more than I'd ever trusted a human being. The knife's edge was finally sharp enough to shave with. I set it down with a clean ring against the wood and reached for the coffee pot. I was halfway through my cup, the bitter heat a welcome shock, when a knock came at the door. It was so faint at first I thought it was just the wind testing a loose board. Then it came again, sharper this time, insistent. I froze the cup, hovering halfway to my lips. My first thought was trouble. Visitors after dark in this part of the country rarely brought good news. My hand instinctively drifted toward the rifle hanging on its pegs by the door, a habit forged in years when a moment's hesitation could be your last. But I stopped myself. There was no sound of horses, no shouted words, just the sighing of the trees. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to force their way in. Setting the cup down, I stood and crossed the cabin in 3 long strides. My heart was a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. I slid the heavy wooden bar from its brackets and pulled the door inward. The cold hit me like a physical blow, a fist of icy air that stole the warmth from the room. And with it came the sight of her. She was standing on the stoop, barefoot, her toes a bruised blue against the frost-dusted wood. Mud was caked to her heels, and her hair, a wild tangle of black silk and cedar needles, was whipped across her face by the wind. For a moment it hid her from me, and then a gust pulled it back, revealing her fully. Her eyes were wide, dark, and watchful like a doe's cornered by wolves. She wore a deerskin dress once fine, but now torn nearly to the hip, its laces pulled crooked where they hadn't snapped entirely. The damp fabric clung to her, outlining a body that was lean but not yet wasted by hunger. She trembled not just from the cold, but from a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I said nothing. My mind, usually as quiet as the mountains, was racing. She was Apache, I could tell by the cut of her dress and the few shell beads that still clung to it. She carried no weapon, no bundle, nothing but the raw pride and utter desperation in her stance. She looked like she was on the verge of collapsing right where she stood. "Please," she whispered. The word was rough, fractured by the cold and a heavy accent, but it was the most human sound I'd heard in months. It cut through the wall of silence I'd built around myself. That one word decided it. I stepped back, pulling the door wider in a silent invitation. She crossed the threshold without meeting my eyes, her movements slow and stiff, as if her legs might give out at any moment. She brought the smell of wet earth and winter with her, a scent that was sharp and wild against the dry, smoky air of the cabin. I slid the bar back into place, the heavy thud echoing in the sudden stillness. I reached for a thick wool blanket from a peg on the wall. "Sit," I said, my voice gravelly from disuse. I pulled a chair closer to the stove for her. She lowered herself into it carefully, as if her joints were made of glass. I draped the blanket over her shoulders, tucking it around her. I could feel the violent tremors running through her body. Her fingers were stiff and blue-tipped when I pressed the tin cup of lukewarm coffee into them. She had to use both hands to hold it steady. She sipped it slowly, then again, the warmth seeming to coax a faint flush of color back into her cheeks. I watched her, trying not to make it obvious. 1,000 questions burned in my mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? And the most dangerous one was someone looking for her. Bringing her in could be inviting a fight I didn't want, but leaving her out there to the mercy of the wind and the cold, that wasn't just wrong. It was a death sentence. I'd seen enough death to last a lifetime. I wouldn't be the cause of another. "What's your name?" I asked finally, my voice softer than I intended. She looked at me over the rim of the cup, her lips chapped and raw. "Annaba," she said the word, soft and careful. "Silas," I replied. She simply nodded, holding my gaze for a heartbeat too long before looking back down at the steam rising from her cup. I turned to the stove, adding the last of my leftover beans and a strip of salt pork to a pan. The smell of it sizzling filled the small cabin, a comforting, familiar scent. For the first time in a long time, I didn't mind sharing it. When the beans were hot, I slid the plate in front of her. She ate just as I expected, slowly at first, then with a quiet urgency, until the only sound in the room was the scrape of her spoon against the tin plate. I didn't press her with questions. I saw the deep gash on her leg where the dress was torn, the raw scrapes on her arms. I saw the way her eyes darted around the cabin, not with fear, but with a kind of careful assessment, as if she was measuring the space and the man in it. When her plate was empty, her head began to nod with exhaustion. I pointed to the bed in the corner, my bed. "Sleep," I said. She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the blanket. For a moment I thought she might refuse, that her pride wouldn't allow it, but then a shudder ran through her, and she gave a small, defeated nod. She crossed the room, her bare feet silent on the floorboards, and lay down on the mattress, still in her torn dress. She pulled the heavy quilt over herself and turned her face to the wall, a small huddled shape in the dim light. I took a spare blanket and stretched out on the floor by the stove, its fading warmth a small comfort against the cold seeping up through the planks. I lay there for a long time, listening to the wind press against the logs and the sound of her breathing, as it slowly deepened and evened out into the rhythm of sleep. The silence I had cultivated for so long had been broken. A single knock, a single whispered word had changed the landscape of my world. I stared at the dark rafters above, wondering what the morning would bring and whether I had just saved a life or doomed my own. The stove ticked as it cooled, and the cabin settled into a new kind of quiet, one that was no longer empty. The first light of morning was a weak gray thing, filtering through the cracks in the shutters and painting the cabin walls the color of ash. I woke on the floor, my back and shoulders stiff from the hard planks. The first thing I did, a habit from a lifetime ago, was listen. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the soft, steady draw of breath from the bed. She was still there. It hadn't been a dream conjured by loneliness. She was a real and solid presence in my quiet world, a small form huddled beneath the quilt, her dark hair, a stark contrast against the pale pillowcase. I rose quietly, my bare feet finding the biting cold of the floor. I fed 2 splits of dry pine into the stove, coaxing the embers back to life. Orange light flickered and waves of heat began to push back the chill. As I filled the kettle with water from the bucket, I felt the strangeness of the situation settle over me again. The cabin felt different, smaller, charged with the presence of another human being. The quiet was no longer the empty quiet of solitude, but the full waiting quiet of 2 people sharing a space. The questions from last night returned, more pressing in the sober light of day. Why was she alone, miles from any known settlement or trail? Was someone hunting her? The kind of man who would leave a woman barefoot in the wilderness was the kind of man who wouldn't give up easily. I didn't like the answers my own experience provided. But looking at her still lost in a sleep that seemed more like a collapse, I knew I couldn't ask her. Not yet. She looked as fragile as a winter leaf. A harsh word might be enough to make her crumble. The water began to hiss, and I set the coffee to boil. I found the last of yesterday's cornbread, dry at the edges but serviceable. The smell of coffee and warming bread filled the room, and it was that scent, I think, that finally woke her. There was a small sound from the bed, a soft sigh, and then she shifted. Her head lifted slowly, and her eyes, dark and still clouded with sleep, found me. They darted to the fire, then back to me, and I saw a subtle easing in her shoulders, as if she had braced herself to wake up alone in the cold again. "Morning," I said, my voice low and even. She blinked, pushing herself up into a sitting position, clutching the quilt around her like a shield. She nodded once. "Morning," she echoed, her voice soft and halting. The clarity of her English surprised me. I brought her a cup of coffee, cooled with a splash of water from the bucket. Her hands were still raw-looking, but they were steadier today as she took the cup. She took a sip and closed her eyes for a moment, a small, involuntary expression of relief. When I set a plate with the warmed cornbread and a strip of dried venison in front of her, she murmured something in her own language, a sound too low for me to catch. I assumed it was thanks. She ate with a careful, deliberate neatness that spoke of habit rather than ravenous hunger. It told me something about her. There was a discipline in her, a pride, that hadn't been broken by whatever ordeal she had endured. I watched her hands as she ate small but strong, and I noticed the intricate beadwork on the torn cuff of her dress, a detail I'd missed in the dim light last night. When she was finished, I gestured to a wooden tub I'd placed near the stove, now filled with warm water from the kettle. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I turned my back to give her privacy, busying myself with stacking firewood, listening to the soft rhythmic sounds of her washing. The cabin's air changed, the smoky masculine scent of pine and old leather, mingling with the clean smell of soap and damp skin. It was a scent my cabin hadn't known in a very long time. When I turned back, she had combed through her long dark hair with the small pocket comb I'd left on the table. The worst of the grime was gone from her face and hands, revealing the fine lines of her cheekbones and the determined set of her jaw. She had done it all quickly, efficiently, like someone accustomed to making do with very little. I laid out a pair of soft rabbit fur moccasins I'd gotten in a trade, and my spare flannel shirt, clean but worn thin at the elbows. These might fit, I said, my words feeling clumsy and loud in the quiet room. She looked at the items, then at me, and a flicker of something, gratitude maybe, or just understanding, passed through her dark eyes. She slid her feet into the moccasins and pulled the large shirt on over her torn dress. It swallowed her, hanging nearly to her knees. She had to roll the sleeves up several times before her hands reappeared. The dark red of the flannel brought a warmth to her face, and I found myself looking at her a moment longer than was strictly necessary. I cleared my throat and turned toward the door. "There's work to be done," I said, pulling on my coat. I glanced back at her. "Come." She hesitated for only a second before grabbing the wool blanket and draping it over her shoulders, following me out into the sharp, clean air of the morning. The frost was thick on the corral rails, glittering in the thin sunlight. I showed her where a rail had been loosened by the wind tapping the post and demonstrating how the brace needed to be reset. She watched my every move, her gaze intense and focused, as if she were committing each action to memory. When I was ready to drive the spike, she knelt in the cold dirt without being asked, holding the rail steady for me. Her grip was firm, her posture balanced. It was clear she was no stranger to hard work. Later, we hauled water from the creek, my hatchet ringing out as it broke through the skin of ice that had formed overnight. The water sloshed against our boots, freezing into gray patterns by the time we got back to the cabin. Inside, she set her bucket down and immediately moved to tend the fire, her movements economical and sure. As she crouched, the blanket slipped and the edge of my flannel shirt shifted at her shoulder. I saw the clean, strong line of her collarbone, and I turned away quickly, my jaw tight. I busied myself stacking the wood we'd brought in, the image staying in my mind. They darted to the fire, then back to me, and I saw a subtle easing in her shoulders, as if she had braced herself to wake up alone in the cold again. "Morning," I said, my voice low and even. She blinked, pushing herself up into a sitting position, clutching the quilt around her like a shield. She nodded once. "Morning," she echoed, her voice soft and halting. The clarity of her English surprised me. I brought her a cup of coffee, cooled with a splash of water from the bucket. I stood by the corral, my breath pluming in the air, the old bay gelding stamping his feet with slow impatience. The cabin door creaked open, and Annaba stepped out, wrapped in the wool blanket over my flannel shirt. Her feet were silent in the moccasins as she crossed the hard frozen ground. Her hair was loose today, and the morning light caught in the dark waves. I still didn't know her story. I didn't know what had driven her up my ridge or what ghosts were chasing her. But I knew two things for certain. She was a survivor, and for now she was staying. I would see to that. Whatever trouble came with it, I'd face it when it arrived. For the first time in 5 years, the thought of a fight didn't make me tired. It was a strange and unsettling feeling. The sun was a pale coin in the vast cold sky. I chewed on the inside of my cheek, cinching a rail tight, and told myself I'd ask her when the time was right. Not when she still looked like a harsh wind could blow her over. "Cold?" I asked. The word was short-clipped. She looked up, her dark eyes unreadable in the morning light, and gave a single sharp nod. "Cold," she repeated, her voice soft. "Work helps," I said, handing her a coil of rope. I showed her the knot I used to secure the gate, my calloused fingers moving slowly and deliberately. I watched as she copied the motion, her own fingers fumbling at first, then moving with a growing confidence, until the knot was a near-perfect mirror of my own. She was a quick study. She didn't shy away from labor, and she didn't ask for pity. I respected that. We hauled water again, the ice on the creek thicker today. Her breath came in ragged puffs in the frigid air, but she didn't utter a word of complaint. When she slipped on the muddy bank, her hand shot out to catch herself. I was there in an instant, my hand closing around her forearm to steady her. I felt the lean, hard muscle beneath her skin, a surprising strength. She righted herself, her expression calm, and wiped the mud from her hand without a word. But she lifted her eyes to mine for a fraction of a second, and in that brief glance, I saw a flicker of gratitude that was more eloquent than any spoken thanks. Back in the warmth of the cabin, I stoked the stove until it radiated a fierce heat, easing the ache from our frozen hands. I cooked beans again. It was all I had in any real quantity. I dropped in the last piece of salt pork, making sure to ladle the thickest part of the broth into her bowl. She sat at the table, her back straight, though I could see the exhaustion pulling at her shoulders. I noticed she had mended the long tear in her deerskin dress. She must have done it last night by the firelight, using the all-in-wax thread I'd left on the table. The stitches were small, neat, and even. It was the work of someone who knew how to make things last. Someone who came from people who valued skill and patience. After we ate, she took the comb from the table and began to work it through her hair, her movements slow and methodical. I watched her from the corner of my eye as I scraped the plates. I wasn't a man given to staring, but it was hard not to notice the subtle changes in her. The desperate, hunted look was fading, replaced by a quiet composure. She was finding her footing right here in my isolated world. I still burned with the need to know her story, but something in her quiet dignity held me back. There was a wall of pride around her, and I knew that if I pushed too hard it might shatter, and I would lose whatever fragile trust was beginning to form between us. So I pushed the questions down and spoke of practical things. "I need to ride down to the lower fence line tomorrow," I said, my voice filling the small space. "Check for breaks before the next snow." She looked at me, her brow furrowed slightly as she parsed my words. Then with a slow, deliberate certainty, she said, "I help." I met her gaze. The word hung in the air between us. Help. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement. She wasn't a guest seeking charity. She was a partner offering her labor in exchange for shelter. That simple declaration sat better with me than I would have thought possible. It felt right. "All right," I said, and left it at that. Later, as dusk settled over the ridge, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, I sat by the stove, honing the edge of my knife. Annabelle moved silently around the cabin, folding the blanket on the bed, setting my shirt to dry on the back of a chair. As she passed behind me, the soft flannel of her sleeve brushed against my arm. The touch was light, accidental, but it sent a jolt through me, a spark of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. I sat perfectly still until she had moved away. I told myself it was just the prolonged isolation, the strangeness of having another person so close. I told myself a lot of things as I slid the knife back into its sheath. That night, I lay on the floor again, listening to the wind scraping at the logs. I was close enough to the stove to feel its warmth, close enough to the bed to hear the soft, even rhythm of her breathing. She wasn't shivering anymore. The questions could wait. The coming storm couldn't. And for tonight, that was more than enough. The snow began in the dead of night, a silent, relentless fall that buried the world while we slept. I woke before dawn, an old soldier's habit of rising before the enemy. I eased myself up from the floor, my joints protesting the cold planks. My first glance was to the bed. She was still there, curled beneath the quilt, her dark braid, a stark line against the white pillow. I stood for a long moment, just listening to the sound of her breathing, a quiet rhythm against the profound, muffled hush of the snow-filled world outside. I hadn't shared my space with another breathing soul in 5 years. The sound of it, so simple and vital, struck me with a force that left me unsteady. I dressed in the gloom, pulling on my heavy boots, and stepped outside. The air was a razor so cold it seemed to catch in my lungs. The snow was coming down hard now, thick flakes swirling in the air, already piling in deep drifts against the cabin. I cinched my collar tight and made my way to the corral, my boots sinking deep with each step. The gelding stood with his head down, a thick blanket of white already accumulated on his back. I brushed him off, my hands numb, and used the back of my hatchet to shatter the thick ice that had formed on the water trough. When I pushed the cabin door open again, a wave of warmth and the smell of wood smoke and warming beans washed over me. Annabelle was up. The quilt was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. She was wearing my flannel shirt, but she'd used a strip of leather to belt it at her waist, giving it some shape. She had even found a pair of my thick wool socks, which she'd pulled up over her moccasins. Her hair was in a single thick braid down her back, swinging slightly as she turned from the stove. She was stirring the pot of beans with a wooden spoon, her movements so natural, and assured it was as if she'd been doing it every morning for years. "Snow," I said, stating the obvious as I stamped my boots on the threshold. She glanced past me at the wall of white that was quickly obscuring the world, then her dark eyes met mine. "Bad," she said. It was a statement, not a question. "Not yet," I shook my head. but it will be. I stripped off my snow-caked coat and hung it by the fire where it immediately began to steam. Over our meal of beans, I laid out the situation plainly. The lower fence will have to wait. This storm is settling in for a while. We're staying put. She nodded, her expression serious. Then she said something in her own language, a soft, guttural string of words, and tapped her own chest before pointing out the window toward the snow-shrouded pines. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the meaning perfectly. My people, out there. I studied her face, saw the flicker of worry in her eyes. I answered her with the simple, hard truth. If they were close, they would have found shelter by now. It wasn't meant as a comfort, just a fact. But I saw her take a slightly deeper breath, as if my words had eased some small part of her burden. After breakfast, we worked to brace the porch roof, which was already groaning under the weight of the accumulating snow. I set a new post under the main beam while she held it steady, her hands surprisingly strong, her body braced against the wind that knifed through the gaps in the porch. Later, inside the warm cocoon of the cabin, I showed her how to bank the fire, how to arrange the logs and control the draft, to keep the coals burning hot and slow through the long night. She watched intently, her eyes following my every move, absorbing the knowledge. As the light outside faded to a thin gray gloom and the storm intensified, we sat in the relative silence of the cabin. I worked on a piece of pine with my drawing knife, shaving it down to make a new handle for my axe. She sat near the stove, watching the thin curls of wood fall to the floor at my feet. The silence between us was no longer empty or awkward. It was a shared space, comfortable and lived in. After a while, she leaned forward close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her, the soft brush of her sleeve against my arm. For a long minute, neither of us moved. The only sounds were the howl of the wind outside and the crackle of the fire within. Then her hand came to rest on my arm. The touch was light, hesitant, a question. I stopped my work, the drawing knife resting in my lap. For 2 days, I had told myself I wouldn't cross a line. A man who has lived in solitude for as long as I have learns to be cautious. But when I looked at her, her dark eyes were soft, unguarded for the first time since she had arrived at my door. And in that moment, something I had locked away deep inside me, something I thought had died in the war, broke loose. "You're safe here," I said, my voice low and rough. It was the only promise I knew for certain I could keep. Her hand slid from my arm to my wrist, her fingers warm against the old faded scars there. Then she leaned in and kissed me. It was a quick, almost shy kiss, a test. I drew back for a breath, a part of me still fighting a war that had ended years ago. But when I saw the quiet certainty in her eyes, the simple truth of her gesture, I closed the small distance between us and kissed her back. There was no rush, no desperation. It was a slow, steady kiss, as relentless and as sure as the storm pressing against the cabin walls. When we finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against mine. She whispered a word in her own language, a word I didn't know but understood completely. That night, as the wind howled and the cabin shuddered under the weight of the snow, we shared the bed for the first time. There was no need for words. The simple, profound warmth of her body pressed against mine, her hand laced in mine, said everything that mattered. In a world where talk was cheap and survival was everything, we had found a new language. Morning broke not with light, but with a deeper shade of gray. The wind hadn't lessened. It had gained a voice, a deep, mournful howl that seemed to press in on the cabin from all sides. I came awake slowly, aware first of the warmth beside me, a solid living heat that was a stark contrast to the cold that seeped through the log walls. Anaba was pressed against my back, her breathing a soft, even rhythm against my shoulder blades. I lay still, staring at the rough-hewn rafters, feeling a strange sense of peace in the heart of the storm. The world outside was chaos, but in this small space there was a quiet stillness. When she stirred, it was with a soft sigh. Her eyes opened, and in the dim light they were dark pools of calm. There was no awkwardness, no regret. Just a quiet acceptance of where we were. I slid out of the bed, the cold floor a shock to my bare feet, and went to the stove. The fire had burned low, but the coals were still hot. I fed it more wood until it roared back to life, the sound a defiant answer to the wind. "Stay warm," I said, glancing back at her. She nodded, pulling the heavy quilt tighter around her shoulders. Outside, the world had vanished. The snow was no longer falling. It was being driven horizontally by the gale, a blinding white curtain that had swallowed the trees, the corral, the entire ridge. Drifts were piled halfway up the cabin walls, and the wind had sculpted them into strange wave-like shapes. I shoveled a narrow path to the corral, the effort leaving me breathless, the wind tearing at my clothes and trying to rip the shovel from my hands. The gelding stood hunched and miserable, caked in snow. I broke the ice on his trough again, my hands aching with a cold, so deep it felt like fire. This wasn't just a snowstorm, it was a blizzard, a siege. Back inside, stamping the snow from my boots, I felt a grim reality settle in my gut. We were trapped. I looked at our meager supplies, half a sack of beans, a few strips of salt pork, a little cornmeal. It was a week's worth of food maybe if we were careful. After that, we'd be at the mercy of the weather. Annabeth seemed to read my thoughts. She looked from my face to the dwindling supplies, her expression calm but serious. How long, she asked, her English slow but clear. A week, I said the words, stark and honest. If we stretch it. She didn't panic. She simply nodded once, a gesture of grim understanding, and turned to the task at hand, clearing the table from our meager breakfast. Her composure was a strange comfort. I had expected fear, maybe even tears. Instead, she met the threat with the same quiet resilience she had shown from the beginning. The days that followed blurred into a routine dictated by survival. We spoke little, but we worked together with an unspoken understanding. I split wood, she mended my torn clothes with a skill that amazed me. We ate our small rations in silence. The howling of the wind, a constant reminder of our precarious situation. One afternoon, as I was repairing a broken harness strap, the questions that had been simmering in my mind finally boiled over. I had to know. I had to understand the path that had led her to my door. Annabeth, I began, my voice sounding loud in the quiet cabin. You have people. Someone looking for you. She paused in her work, her hands stilling over the piece of leather she was stitching. She stared at the needle for a long moment before she spoke, her voice so low I had to strain to hear it. No people now. A beat of silence, heavy and profound. Then even softer, gone. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The single word, filled with a world of loss, told me everything I needed to know. Sickness, a raid, starvation. It didn't matter. The result was the same. She wasn't running to someone. She was running from an emptiness I knew all too well. A weight settled in my chest, a fierce protective anger at a world that could so easily erase a family of people and leave a single soul to wander in the snow. That night the storm reached its peak. The wind hammered at the cabin and the old logs groaned in protest. The stove glowed red, a defiant heart of warmth in the frozen world. We lay together under the quilt, the sound of the storm a wild symphony outside. I thought about the irony of it. I had come to this ridge seeking solitude, a fortress against the world. And now, in the heart of a storm that had cut me off completely, I was less alone than I had been in years. Her hand came up to my jaw, her touch gentle, turning my face to hers. In the flickering firelight, her eyes held a depth of emotion that stole my breath. There were no more questions, no more doubts. Need might have brought her to my door, but what had grown between us in this snowbound cabin was something more. It was a choice. She kissed me, and this time there was no hesitation, no testing. It was a kiss of deep, soulful connection, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between us in the crucible of the storm. I pulled her close, the ghosts of my past finally silenced by the living, breathing woman in my arms. The world could rage outside. In here we had found a fragile, precious peace. The storm broke on the 5th day. We woke not to the howling of the wind, but to a profound, ringing silence. A weak, watery sunlight filtered through the chinks in the logs, painting stripes of light on the floor. I stepped outside into a world transformed. The ridge was buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white, the snow glittering under the hard blue sky. The air was still and cold, so cold it hurt to breathe. But the wind was gone. The siege was over. Our food was nearly gone. A handful of beans, a sliver of salt pork. We had stretched it as far as we could, but the reality was stark. The trail would be impassable for days, maybe a week. We had survived the storm, but now we had to survive the aftermath. That morning, Annabeth did something that surprised me. While I was checking on the gelding, she took my rifle from its pegs. When I came back inside, she was standing by the door, holding it out to me. On the table, she had laid out a pair of snowshoes she had fashioned from bent willow branches and strips of rawhide. "We hunt," she said, her voice firm. I looked at her, then at the snowshoes. They were skillfully made. Another piece of her past, another skill learned from a life I could only imagine. I had been so focused on my own ability to provide, on my role as the protector, that I hadn't considered hers. The snow is deep, I argued, my pride stinging. It's a man's work. Her dark eyes flashed with a fire I hadn't seen before. My people hunt in snow. My father taught me. She tapped her chest. I am not a child to be sheltered. We survive together, or we die together. Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. She was right. I had been seeing her as someone to be saved, not as an equal partner in our survival. I took the rifle from her hand, my fingers brushing hers. "All right," I said, my voice rough with a mix of shame and admiration. Together, we spent the day hunting. It was grueling work wading through the chest-deep snow, the cold, a constant gnawing presence. But Inaba moved with a skill and grace that left me humbled. She saw things I missed: the faint track of a snowshoe hare, the subtle disturbance in the snow that marked a grouse's roost. She was a part of this wilderness in a way I, with all my years on the ridge, had never been. Late in the afternoon, her patience was rewarded. A young buck driven down from the high peaks by the storm crossed our path. My shot was true. The work of field dressing the animal and hauling it back to the cabin was exhausting. But as we worked side by side, our breath misting in the frigid air, I felt a new kind of connection to her. It was a partnership forged not in the warmth of the cabin, but in the harsh reality of the frozen world outside. That night we feasted on fresh venison roasted over the fire. The taste of it was rich and life-giving. We were no longer starving. We had provided for ourselves. Together. After we ate, we sat by the fire, the comfortable silence stretching between us. I looked at her at the firelight playing on her strong, proud features, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my soul that I loved her. The realization was as terrifying as it was profound. Love was a vulnerability I had sworn off years ago. It was a risk, a potential for pain and loss that I had built my entire solitary life to avoid. "Inaba," I said, my voice barely a whisper. She turned to me, her dark eyes questioning. I didn't have the words to express the storm of emotion inside me, so I did the only thing I could. I reached out and took her hand, lacing my fingers through hers. I brought her hand to my lips and kissed her calloused knuckles. It was a gesture of reverence, of surrender. She understood. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face, transforming her. She leaned in and rested her head on my shoulder, her body fitting against mine as if it were made to be there. We sat like that for a long time, the fire crackling, the silence filled with everything we couldn't say. The thaw had begun not just on the ridge, but in the frozen landscape of my own heart. A week later, the sun had worked its magic on the snow. The deep drifts had begun to melt and compact, and the trail down the ridge, while still treacherous, was passable. Our supply of fresh meat was a godsend, but we were out of everything else: flour, coffee, salt, lard. It was time for me to make the ride to the trading post. The thought of leaving Inaba alone, even for a day, filled me with a cold dread. The world beyond this ridge was not a kind place for a lone Apache woman, but we had no choice. The morning I was to leave, the air was crisp and clean. Inaba stood by the corral as I saddled the gelding, her expression unreadable. She had braided her hair and was wearing my flannel shirt, which now seemed to fit her as if it were her own. "You are sure?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I have to," I said, pulling the cinch tight. "I'll ride hard. I'll be back before nightfall." She stepped forward and pressed something into my hand. It was a small, smooth stone, a piece of river rock worn smooth by years of water. It was warm from her skin. "For safety," she said. I closed my fingers around it, the warmth of it a small comfort. I turned to her, meaning to say something to reassure her, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I pulled her to me and kissed her, a hard, desperate kiss that spoke of my fear and my promise to return. She clung to me for a moment, her arms tight around my neck. Then she stepped back, her face composed, though I saw the worry in the depths of her dark eyes. "Come back, Silas," she whispered. "Always," I promised, my voice rough. I swung into the saddle and rode out without looking back. To look back would be to admit the possibility that I might not see her standing there again. The ride was hellish. The trail was a slick, muddy mess of melting snow and ice. The gelding stumbled several times, and my own muscles ached with the effort of keeping my seat. But my physical discomfort was nothing compared to the turmoil in my mind. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every gust of wind sounded like a warning. The trading post was a low, squat building hunkered down in a stand of cottonwood trees. It was a place I avoided unless absolutely necessary, a gathering spot for the kind of rough, transient men I had spent my life trying to forget. As I tied off the gelding, I saw two such men lounging on the porch, their faces hard and unshaven, their eyes cold and assessing. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, the familiar smell of dust tobacco and cheap whiskey hitting me. The clerk, a nervous man with ink-stained fingers, looked up as I entered. The two men from the porch followed me, in their boots loud on the wooden floor. "Need supplies," I said to the clerk, my voice flat. "Flour, beans, coffee, salt." As the clerk began to measure out the goods, one of the strangers spoke, his voice a low, gravelly drawl. "That's a hard ride in this weather." A man must have a powerful reason to leave a warm fire. I ignored him, keeping my eyes on the clerk. The man chuckled, a nasty grating sound. Maybe he's got a warm squaw waiting for him. I hear the Apache women are real grateful for a white man's protection. A white-hot rage, cold and sharp, shot through me. It was an old familiar feeling, the battle lust I thought I had buried years ago. I turned slowly, my hand resting near the butt of the Colt tucked into my belt. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him, letting him see the promise of violence in my eyes. I let him see that I was not a man to be trifled with, that I had killed before and would not hesitate to do so again. He was a bully, not a fighter. He blustered for a moment, his eyes shifting. Then he looked away, muttering something under his breath. His companion, who had been watching the exchange with a smirk, suddenly seemed to find something interesting to look at out the window. I paid the clerk, loaded the heavy sacks onto my shoulder, and walked out, the weight of their stares on my back. The ride home was a blur of urgency. I pushed the gelding harder than I should have, my mind filled with dark possibilities. What if they decided to follow me? What if they had seen my trail and knew I had a cabin on the ridge? By the time I saw the thin plume of smoke rising from my chimney, the sun was a bloody smear on the horizon. Relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. I practically fell out of the saddle, grabbing the supplies and stumbling to the door. I threw it open. She was there, standing by the stove, a knife in her hand, her body tensed, ready to fight. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a wave of relief as she saw me. She dropped the knife, and in 2 steps she was in my arms, her body trembling. I held her tight, burying my face in her hair, breathing in her scent. "I'm back," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm home." In the warmth of her embrace, I knew that this cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a home, and I would burn the world to the ground to keep it. And her safe spring arrived on the ridge, not with a sudden burst, but as a slow, quiet promise. The last of the snow melted away, revealing the damp, dark earth beneath. The creek, freed from its icy prison, ran high and fast. The aspens began to bud, their leaves a pale, tender green against the dark pines. The air itself seemed to change, losing its sharp, biting edge, and taking on the soft, loamy scent of new life. With the coming of spring, a new rhythm settled over our lives. We were no longer just surviving. We were building. We worked side by side, a comfortable silence often stretching between us, punctuated by the easy shorthand language of 2 people who know each other's movements, each other's thoughts. I repaired the fences the heavy snows had broken, and she planted a small garden in a patch of sun-drenched earth behind the cabin, tending the seeds with a gentle, knowing hand. The questions about her past were gone. I knew all I needed to know from the scars she carried, both visible and not. And she in turn seemed to understand the ghosts that haunted me, the reasons I had sought solace in this high, lonely place. We didn't speak of the past. Our focus was on the present, on the simple, profound joy of a shared meal, a warm bed, a life carved out of the wilderness together. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard, I was putting the finishing touches on a new sturdy chair I had built for her. She came and stood beside me, watching my hands as I smoothed the last rough edge of the wood. "It is good," she said, her voice soft. "It'll hold," I replied, my own voice rough with an emotion I couldn't name. She laid her hand on my arm, her touch sending a familiar warmth through me. "You have made this a home, Silas." I looked at her, at the setting sun glinting in her dark hair, at the quiet strength in her face, and the words came to me simple and true. "No, Anaba, you did." This story teaches us that even in the darkest seasons of life, there is always room for renewal if we are willing to open our hearts. Silas believed solitude was the only way to survive his pain, yet the arrival of Anaba revealed that true strength is found not in isolation but in companionship. Together they endured hardship, hunger, and storms, proving that resilience is not just about endurance. It is about sharing the burden, trusting another soul, and finding comfort in kindness. For older audiences, this carries a timeless lesson. Age, grief, or hardship do not strip us of value. In fact, the wisdom gained through loss and the patience forged by time are often the very foundations that allow us to build love anew. No matter how many years have passed, life still holds the possibility of connection, healing, and hope. It reminds us that second chances can appear when we least expect them, sometimes as quietly as a knock at the door. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.